Okay, welcome back to our study of the Republic. We're ready to return now, excuse me, to that spot in Book 2 of the Republic where we broke off the conversation in the first lecture at the point where, after Socrates has started describing how the city comes into being, Glaucon interrupted and said, you're not describing the city nowadays. So I want to go through and talk about that. I basically want to talk about the remainder of Book 2. We so far focused on the first part of a conversation that Socrates has with Glaucon and the Adeimantus about where the city comes from. There's an earlier part of Book 2 I haven't talked about yet, but that's the part we've done so far. Now I want to look at the next part, which runs basically from 372c to 376d. I want to go through that where Socrates and Glaucon talk about this city nowadays. And then there's a part after that when Adeimantus interrupts them. So this happens because Glaucon interrupted the conversation Socrates was having with Adeimantus. Then, a later point, Adeimantus is going to interrupt this new conversation that Socrates is having with Glaucon. That's at 376d, and from there to the end of Book 2, which is 382c, they talk about something a little bit different. And the thing they talk about there carries on into Book 3. So I want to try to get through all of that. But the thing I want to focus on first is just reading through fairly carefully, or paying pretty careful attention to the specific things that come up in this just little interlude with Glaucon. I call it an interlude, but it's one of the most important things in the whole book. But this point when Glaucon interrupted Adeimantus, and before he's going to get in turn interrupted by Adeimantus again. And so this is the part where he describes the city nowadays. So let's just begin with that. So he says, he's criticizing the city that Socrates and Adeimantus were developing when they said, people come together out of need and different people bring together their specialized skills to produce a kind of division of labor across a whole society such that everybody prospers much more substantially than individuals would if they were each working on their own, right? And they produced their nice little story, and Glaucon says, that's not satisfactory. And Glaucon says, well, if you were providing for a city of sows, Socrates, what else would you fatten them than this? So he's complaining about what these people are going to eat. And he says, yeah, if you want to just fatten up pigs, you could feed them these things. And that's what you're feeding these people. Shouldn't you be feeding them something better? And so Socrates says, oh, how should it be, Glaucon? And Glaucon says, well, in the way as is conventional. Or as is customary, I suppose men who aren't going to be wretched recline on couches, and they eat from tables, and they have relishes and desserts, just like men have nowadays. So that's the reference to nowadays that I was talking about. So he says, sure, you've described a way that people can live, but that's not what we want. We want a city where people can have things that they actually enjoy. They can recline on a nice couch and eat nice desserts. And so Socrates says, oh, all right, I understand. We are, as it seems, considering not only how a city, but also a luxurious city comes into being. He says, maybe that's not bad either. For in considering such a city too, we could probably see in what way justice and injustice naturally grow in cities. Now, so before getting into any of the subsequent details, I want you just to think about what happened there. Because it seems to me a very dramatic change happened here, and it's one that it's easy to ignore if you're just sort of reading through casually, and you can really lose the thread. So, I've told you before, these are dialogues, they're portrayals of conversations, they're not philosophical essays. So, one of the main things you have to bring to the reading of them is an attention to the human interaction that's being portrayed, and you have to bring a reasonable understanding of what people are like and what human behavior means to be able to get this. So, I went through that conversation with Cephalus at the beginning of Book 1 fairly carefully, and something similar is what I want you to do here. This is another point where I think you really need to pay attention to the human exchange. And so it's not a small deal that Glaucon interrupted. Right? Socrates was having a conversation with Adeimantus. They were talking about something and they were moving through it step by step. And that conversation could have continued step by step somewhere. but it didn't, because somebody who wasn't one of the people speaking interrupted and said, I want to talk about this instead. So interruption is kind of a death blow to things, right? Like, you're never going to find out where that other conversation was going to go, first of all. And second, when Glaucon interrupted, he had on his mind some things that mattered. And, he's part of the conversation in the sense that the larger thing is all of them talking. And it makes sense sometimes in conversations that you say, no, I want you to talk about this thing. I'm thinking about this. What about this? What about this, right? It makes sense that happens. It doesn't make you a bad person automatically because you do it. But the thing to notice is that the perspective that Glaucon is working with isn't just automatically or naturally the same perspective that was defining that conversation, right? And so that's what I mean when I say something took a dramatic shift, right? Suddenly the conversation is about what Glaucon wanted to talk about. And as you'll see in a moment, it's not hard to see that there's something pretty different that's going to happen in this conversation from what happened in that other one. So in this dialogue, as in interactions with people in general, like, you got to pay attention to who's speaking, and you got to pay attention to whether the thing that unfolds in a conversation is really holding on to the thing that was happening in the earlier part of that conversation, right? So the big difference here is, in that first part of the conversation, Socrates was engaged in a kind of derivation. They were saying, where in principle do cities or human societies come from? So they were thinking about the very nature of what we mean by a society, and in a kind of philosophical way, they were analyzing the sort of conceptually where it comes from and why it comes into being. And they were doing the same kind of thing, they were describing, they were trying to describe, by thinking about it carefully, what would really have been the historical origins of society. And those are then the kinds of things that in the real world, anthropologists would study, right? And when they look at the origins of civilization. So Socrates was giving a kind of a anthropological account of where societies come from, and a reasonable one. And they were doing that by reflecting on the very nature of the thing and trying to, well, as he said, bring it into being in logos, in argument, right? They were trying to derive or develop from first principles where societies come from. That stopped because Adeimantus says, that's not what city is like. I want a city like this. And so they describe the kind of city we have. And so now they're going to talk about what societies are like nowadays. And that's a worthwhile thing to do too. But one thing that is not happening there is this is not being derived. There is nothing being done here to show how and why this kind of city nowadays comes into being. The reason it comes into being in their conversation is because Glaucon said he wanted it, right? The source of this topic is Glaucon's insistence. It doesn't emerge naturally from the conversation that Socrates and Adeimantus were having. So you could imagine an account that was like that. You could imagine someone continuing the things Socrates and Adeimantus were talking about to show how the city they've imagined starts to develop and why these other things start to happen that ultimately lead to the kind of city we have nowadays. And that would be a pretty interesting thing. But you don't get that. You don't get that because Glaucon interrupted and just jumped to a different story. And so they move from derivation to a totally different thing. Now they're going to move to description. So basically they're going to say, so okay, let's describe what the city nowadays is like. And they say a bunch of things that are, presumably reasonably accurate and so on. And they're related to the things that they were talking about before. But what you get is a description of the kind of society we have nowadays, and in a certain sense, a description of how that differs from the society Socrates had been talking about, but you don't get a derivation. So, and then when Adeimantus interrupts in a few minutes, something different's going to happen again. But Socrates says, for in considering such a city too, we could probably see in what way justice and injustice naturally grow in cities. Nice idea. Yeah, notice that expression, naturally grow. Like, that's what we were after. We were trying to see how this naturally grows. And Socrates had started such an account, and now that stopped. We're not watching something naturally grow anymore. We're just grabbing something that's already grown. We don't know where it came from. So we're talking about the world we've inherited without, so to speak, showing how it was earned. But he says, yeah, maybe we could still see how justice and injustice naturally grow here. Yeah, there's lots of reasons to talk about that. We'll see what happens. But another thing, Socrates says, okay, you want to talk about the luxurious city. Yeah, this is a city, as Glaucon says, where people have relishes and desserts and where they recline on couches. So yeah, it's a luxurious city in the sense that people have nice things. Well, in fact, I'll show you in 1 second what Socrates says. Well, actually, let's just jump right to that. So at 373a, Socrates says, so in particular, we can't still postulate the mere necessities we were talking about at first, houses, clothes, and shoes. But instead, painting and embroidery must also be set in motion, and gold and ivory and everything of this sort must be obtained, right? And Glaucon says yes. And then he says that, so then this city is going to get bigger. The healthy one, that's his name for the one they had already talked about before, and he calls this one feverish. He says the healthy one isn't adequate anymore, but must already be gorged with the bulky mass of things which are not in cities because of necessities. So the thing I want you to notice there is the language now that Socrates uses to describe this difference, right? So what is it that makes a luxurious city? Well, it has things that are there that are not simply necessities. Okay, what exactly does that mean? It's easy to say, and it's not that hard to understand what he means, but there's more subtlety to it, more philosophical, more of a philosophical issue here than is it made out on the surface. So yes, initially those in the story Socrates was telling before, we saw a city coming into being because people had to do the things that are necessary for life. Notice that word "for" comes after the word "necessary." The things that are necessary for life. So it's true that relishes aren't necessary for life. Right? You got to have something to eat, but it doesn't have to taste good. You just got to eat, right? But you want relishes because you want things that taste nice, and that's what Socrates is calling luxuries. In other words, those things that are above necessities. Well, yeah, they're above necessities for life. But could there be other kinds of necessities? Right? Remember that Socrates in the Apology drew a pretty important distinction. Right? Remember his closing remark before the jury comes to its verdict of guilty. He said, "The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being." So what he's saying is, from the point of your humanity, self-examination is necessary. Right? And then take that back to that, and that was the end of his little speech. Take it back to the beginning of that part of the speech, right? He's dealt with the charges from Miletus, and then he says, okay, let me tell you who I am, right? And basically the first thing he says is, the important question in a human life is not whether you live or die. Basically, the important question is what you'll die for, what you live and die for, right? What you take a stand on. So, yeah, and I guess that's almost the same point as the unexamined life point. Yes, there are certain things that are necessities for life, but those aren't necessities for your humanity. You know, for your humanity, from the one end of his speech in the Apology, we could say for your humanity, self-examination is necessary. For the beginning of that same speech, we could say from your humanity, taking a stand on important matters, taking a stand on the things that are on the good is what is necessary, right? So there's a big difference between necessary for life and necessary for the fulfillment of your human nature, of your humanity. And so here, when Socrates says, okay, we're not talking about necessities anymore, he's talking about necessities for life. And that's true as far as it goes. But that's not necessities simpliciter, it's necessities for life. And we already know from his other speech that he doesn't believe that the issues of life define the issues for human beings. So when Socrates says, yeah, this is a luxurious city that has things more than what is necessary, yeah, but that also might mean it has the stuff that really makes our distinctive humanity capable of flourishing. Anyway, okay. So and so, for example, look at this with a couple of things he says here. So the first thing he says is, we're not just talking about those necessities like houses, clothes, and shoes, but painting and embroidery. So he's saying that's part of the luxury. Yeah, that is part of the luxury. But I wonder. I'm inclined to think that painting is pretty necessary for human beings, or more broadly, the arts. The Greeks worship those things in their religion, in as much as they recognize the muses and Apollo with his music and so on. The religion in a way says artistic creation is a pretty important part of our world. It's a divine element of our world. I think that reflects a pretty important idea that there's something about what we are as human beings that makes something like art, so painting and embroidery, pretty essential. So yes, on the one hand, you might think, oh, they're talking about decorations. You don't just need clothes, but you need nice looking clothes. Yeah, so maybe that's trivial. It might be more important than you think. But even if we call that trivial, I'm inclined to think that art at a bigger level, at a broader level, has a more substantial role in human life. And that may be why, in fact, that surely is why, Socrates went to the poets to look for wisdom. Because we expect to find wisdom there. And he never said that the poems weren't offering wisdom. He said the poets weren't. He said, I talked to the poets, and they can't really explain their poems very well. And so he used that to talk about why those individuals didn't know what they thought they knew, right? But he doesn't say anywhere that the poems were empty. And in fact, if you go through the dialogues, you'll find Socrates is constantly turning to the wisdom of Greek literature and so on to sort things out. And that's how the Republic conversation got going with Polemarchus. Remember, they quoted Sophocles on you have to give everything what is due, what it's owed, right? Anyway, so as with the Cephalus conversation, so with this conversation, I want you to go through and be careful. Don't move from sentence to sentence thinking, oh yeah, this is all straightforward. Like, as points are made, you have to think yourself about the issue that's being raised there. And don't just let yourself get pushed around by the words Glaucon or Socrates speaks. You got to think through these things. So anyway, so we're in the luxurious city, but maybe that's where we want to live with good reason. So now he's describing it, but again, describing, not deriving. So he describes it. He says, okay, so what are we going to find here? He says, we're going to find all the hunters and imitators, many concerned with figures and colors, music, poets, helpers, rhapsodes, blah, 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 blah. We'll need more servants. We'll need teachers, wet nurses, governesses, beauticians, barbers, cooks, relish makers, swineherds, all this kind of stuff. And then he says, won't we need more doctors too? Because they're really kind of emphasizing the cosmetics and gourmet cooking, right? Saying, oh yeah, you're going to need relishes and you're going to need painting, and they really play that up as like you're going to need beauticians and barbers. It's like that issue of beauty is only about adornment, and yeah, you're going to need gourmet cooks. Like those are the only things they talk about. But obviously the issue, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but upon reflection, I think you can see the issues are a bit deeper than that. But anyway, because of all these relishes people are going to be eating, the relishes we do eat, he says, aren't we going to need more doctors? Yeah, because in the city nowadays, which is to say the city we live in, we don't eat just healthy things. We eat things because they taste good and whatever else. And we have other habits too, like we eat because we're bored or we whatever, And so eating functions in our life in a way that is different from the way it functions in the dog's or the cat's life, right? In those contexts, it seems like it's one of the necessities for life. But eating for a human being has different significance, right? So already, just at the level of eating, you can see, oh yeah, there's something different about human beings. And at the very least, that means in the city where our humanity is allowed to develop and flourish, not just where our life is secured, but where our humanity, the distinctive things about us can grow and flourish. You're going to need doctors because people are going to be confronted with, they're going to have habits of living around eating, for example, that are not going to be the healthiest. Right? And then he says, and land that was sufficient for feeding the men then was small, right? If you, like, you can imagine subsistence farming for a person or for a community. Yeah, this is a little different, right? Because you're going to have to grow different things, and you're going to have crops and whatever else to support, the luxuries, the luxurious life. So he says, so I guess we're going to cut off a piece of our neighbor's land if we're going to have enough room for our pastures and our villages. And then we're also going to need unlimited acquisition of money, overstepping the boundary of the necessary. So again, that notion of necessity comes in, but you got to think necessity for what, right? But anyway, so his point here is, again, it's described. There's a hint of derivation here, but not derivation in the sense of continuing that story from first principles that gets us here. More, what he's saying is, well, since we have these features, aren't these other things also going to have to be in place? So he's saying, if you're going to have a luxurious city, you're going to have doctors to take care of people. And also, isn't it the case that any luxurious city has depended on conquest? Going and stealing land from other people, and hasn't it relied upon money and so on? So he's saying something like, aggressive, greedy acquisition of land, colonizing things, basically, is an inescapable presupposition of the kind of society we're imagining. He's proposing that. He's putting it as a question, so he never outright asserts it, but he says, oh, won't it be like this? And Glaucon says, yes, probably Glaucon didn't think about it enough. Just as Meletus didn't think about it enough when he made those charges. I mean, Glaucon's probably a nicer guy than Meletus, but still, he's just going along with things rather than being the rigorous philosopher that we should be if we're studying philosophy, right? So yeah, Socrates draws your attention to an important connection. Is it necessary? Maybe. Is it factually true? Probably. That the cities that we're talking about have depended on military conquest. So he says, so we'll cut off a piece of our neighbor's land, etc., etc. He says, so then won't we go to war as a consequence? And they say, yeah. So it looks like war is going to be a part of the kinds of societies that we have. Like, if we want to live this way, that means we're buying into war. So that's the description largely of the city nowadays. It's going to have all these other techni, all these other crafts like beautician, swineherd, wet nurse, choral dancer, rhapsode, different kinds of hunters, all these different things that were listed. Doctors, big deal, right? And another one that's going to come up in a second. But it's going to have all those other things. And it's also going to be a city marked by these rich opportunities for adornment and eating. And you could think about what else is going to go on in there too. Are the things that they haven't mentioned that we should imagine there. And it's going to have military conquest and acquisition of money. Those are the things that are added as well. So that's a description of the world we actually live in. I kind of wish they'd derived that rather than just jumping to it. I would like to see how we get from a nice little society of the necessities of life that Socrates was developing and the place we got to. But that's left unanswered here. But now here's the next thing that leads us into the next section. So we've got to this point about war, and that's where Socrates wanted to get to. So he could have said lots more about the city nowadays that Glaucon raised, but as soon as Glaucon raised it, he said, okay, let's get to this point, because here's the thing we're going to need to talk about. I mean, those aren't his words. I'm saying if you look at the way this conversation goes, you can see this is where he was aiming. So he says, okay, now my city, now my friend, the city's going to have to be bigger. If we're going to have wars, we're going to have to have bigger cities because we're going to have an army. And Glaucon says, wait. And here, a very important move is going to happen here. So Glaucon says, wait, why do we need an army? Why can't the citizens just defend themselves and do their own work? And I won't pursue that question, but that's a pretty interesting question because in reality, that's what significantly happened in Greek cities, especially in a city like Athens, where the citizenship was very broad, and those people were all, as we saw, all participated in the fighting by being in the navy and so on, as opposed to cities like Sparta, where with the smaller citizen body, the warrior class basically that was defending the city was quite small. But yeah, so when Glaucon says, why can't they defend themselves? Like, he really is thinking of this idea, whether in Sparta or Athens, he's thinking of this idea that won't the citizens, however he's imagining that, won't the citizens just be defending themselves? And Socrates, so yeah, you should think about that question. But Socrates skips over it pretty fast, and he says, no, here's why. And now this next point is an important one, and I think this one is famous. The things that come out of this are famous. And I also think in a pretty significant way it defines one of the most powerful issues in this book. So Socrates says, I won't read it through, I'll make the point. He said, look, the whole point about the division of labor is that to do something well, have a techne and do it well, you really got to devote yourself to it. Like, you can't just be a doctor on Tuesday and an engineer on Wednesday and a law professor on Wednesday or whatever day I'm at, and whatever else. Like, it doesn't work that way. If you're going to be a doctor, you're going to devote your life to it. And if you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to devote your life to it. And even as I was saying about myself, if you're going to be a university professor and a parent, you might be imagining you're doing too many things. Being a parent is a full-time job. No doubt that's why, or I shouldn't say no doubt that's why. Let me say that differently. I imagine that's a significant part historically of why the men and women have done different things. Right? So there's obviously a very oppressive way in which women have been stuck in the domestic sphere and given the tasks of caring for the family and so on. That sort of gendered division of labor has surely been profoundly unjust. But that there is such a division probably makes a lot of sense, that the demands of running the household are at least as important a job as the demands of doing whatever that work is out in the world that you do to bring in materials for the household and do your public work and whatever else. Indeed, that's one of the reasons that the treatment of women has been so unjust, namely because the work they do in the domestic sphere hasn't been recognized as the work that it is. But so in reality, to try to be a university professor and to be a parent is possibly a little bit unrealistic for a person, because you're trying to do two things, each of which demands your whole life. And so again, like it's an interesting issue in the context of the 20th century, the later 20th century, and broadly speaking, the issue and the reality of women's liberation. Without a doubt, that's been a valuable and important thing. But an interesting consequence of it is that as women entered the sort of public workforce to a much greater extent, there's a tricky kind of backlash against women there, in that it remains the case that they are largely held responsible for domestic work. So it's often been the case that women have just been stuck doing two things. So in a certain way, it's liberating to be brought out into the public world, or to be allowed into the public world. But without corresponding appreciation of the needs of the family and a social organization that allows that to happen well, like it often just means women, and maybe even more than just women, maybe people are just have to work too much. It's really that movement may have just produced a way that more pressure gets put on people without the real troubling living conditions being improved. That's a thought. That's not unrelated to a different issue. Just let me mention it quickly, just because it's relevant to how you think about these things. People often talk about the American Civil War in terms of the liberation of the black slaves in the South. No doubt that, that's a very important theme, and no doubt there is some pretty important way in which that language is correct. But you can also jump into that language too quickly. So, it has been argued, and I think pretty convincingly in a lot of cases, that to a large extent I shouldn't say the effect, but a significant effect of that was that the basically, well, let's say use the word oppressed. The oppressed black working class in the South, who were slaves, now became an oppressed labor class for the North as migrant wage labor for the emerging industries. And so, yes, these people were no longer legally slaves in the sense they had been before, but the effect of that liberation to a significant degree was to take that same oppressed working force, and instead of allowing it to be the working force for the southern plantation owners, they now became the oppressed working force for the northern industrialists, right? Such that the Civil War is, in a way, it's more about whether northern industry is going to overpower southern agriculture and so on. So you can talk about the liberation of the black slaves. There's obviously some pretty significant ways in which that language is correct, but to too quickly accept that description alone might actually conceal some of the more significant things that were really happening, which is really just restructuring the terms under which that same oppressed class continued to be oppressed. So I realize this is getting a bit off topic, but the point I'm trying to make in all of, well, the point I was initially beginning with was the significance of domestic labor. And I wanted to just then relate that to the way there's a problem when you're not recognizing the significance of that. So let me get back to the thing I was actually after. Those issues of oppression and the relationship of Black Americans and women remain pretty significant, and I hope that we will visit them again. But let's go back then to that question of what you do, and the core point behind this is that really you're going to do one thing. So the point Socrates makes here is, we already made that point, and if that's true, then going to war is as much a thing to do well as being a doctor is or being a farmer is. And so if the kind of city we're describing is going to have to cultivate a warrior class, a military, people whose job is to go fight in wars. And they're not going to be the same as the farmers. You're going to have to stop being a farmer if you're going to go to war. And that doesn't just mean you can farm Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then a war comes up and you go fight on Thursday. No, it means you're going to have to devote your life to doing the military thing, just like other people have to devote their life to doing the farming thing. So he says we're going to develop the city we're talking about nowadays is one, because it's in a significant way defined by issues of warfare, it's going to have an army. It's going to have a military class. So that's the crucial argument. And so that now gets us into a position where we're going to be talking about that class and how to construe them. And now, so that takes us up to 374e. Socrates and Glaucon have just made that little argument about, you're going to have to do just one job well. And now from 374e to the end of this thing with Glaucon, we're going to talk about the people who are going to be good soldiers. And that's going to have two parts as well. But again, this here is the part where I think perhaps the biggest issue in the whole Republic gets articulated. So now they say, well, some people are better at certain things than others. And so he says, what kind of person is going to be a good soldier? And so that's why Socrates says at 374e, it's going to be our job to choose who has the best nature for guarding the city, right? What kind of people are going to be the right people to take those kinds of jobs? And so then Socrates makes a comparison. He says, aren't these soldiers going to be like puppies, like good dogs? And he says at 375a, for this reason, surely Both of them need sharp senses, speed to catch what they perceive, and finally strength if they're going to fight it out. Right? You got to be a tough, alert fighter, right? And then he says, and of course they'll need courage if they're going to fight well. And Glaucon says, of course. And then he says, okay, Glaucon, will a horse or a dog or any other animal be willing to be courageous if it's not spirited? And then he says, haven't you noticed how irresistible and unbeatable spirit is, so that its presence makes every soul fearless and invincible in the face of everything? So he's talking about the word thumos there, a word we're going to visit again. And he's saying that that's the people who are going to be good soldiers are going to be people who are ready to fight. And that doesn't just mean they have strong muscles. It means they have that, as he puts it, the irresistible and unbeatable spirit, so that its presence makes every soul fearless and invincible. I mean, basically, the way he's describing it there, thumos means something like your unwillingness to be defeated. Right? So think about that in a person. Some people are wise and thoughtful. Some people are gentle, Some people like to have nice tastes, All of those things can characterize a personality. And a person who primarily has this or this or this, they're going to respond to certain situations a certain way. But surely you have recognized that there are some people who can't stand to lose. That's different from all those other ones, right? Somebody whose life is built around, I gotta win. He says that's who you're going to get for a soldier. You want someone whose life kind of revolves around the idea that they want to come out on top. They don't want to lose. And in fact, if somebody's beaten them, they're going to come back and try to fight them, and they don't mind if they die because they want to be the winner. Right? That's the soldier. That's thumos. That's the character of spirit that makes you unwilling to accept defeat. You might think about Sparta, and what they were doing when they were trying to train people to be soldiers, right? What they're trying to build in them, right? And think about that idea then. This notion of being invincible and unbeatable, right? Your attitude is, I will not accept defeat. So I'd like you to think about that as a character trait or whatever that you might want in a soldier. But I'd also like you to think about what kind of character trait that is in a person. You really want that? What's it like to deal with people like that? Like, there may well be, like maybe in a football game, you want the players on the football team to be like that they're going to really try to fight and win. But do you want that in your romantic partner? Do you want that in your friend when you're trying to decide where to go for dinner? Do you want someone who can't ever accept not to be the top dog? I mean, so it seems to me that character trait could have its place, maybe exactly where Socrates says, maybe. But it seems to me that as a definition of human virtue, that would fall far short, I think. But he's saying, look, isn't that what you're going to need in someone if you're going to want them to be a good soldier? Isn't that the kind of person who's going to develop to be able to develop to be that kind of thing? Somebody who's going to go out and fight and die. Somebody who's going to be like Achilles or whoever. And so, but then Socrates says, well, if that's right, he says this in 375b. He says, well, but Glaucon, with such natures, how will they not be savage to one another and to the rest of the citizens? Yeah, that's kind of, savagery is kind of what you want in a soldier. But if you have someone who's just savage, why are they going to be any nicer to you than to your enemy? So here's a big issue coming up here. He says, but they have to be gentle to their own people. If they're going to be the guardians of the city, the military that works on behalf of the city to do the city's needs, he says they're going to have to be gentle to their own and cruel to their enemies. And you should remember Paul Marx's definition of justice that we just went through quickly was like, be good to your friends and be bad to your enemies. Socrates tried to show there that that was an unsatisfactory notion of justice overall. But it's interesting that it has its place, right? That is presumably what you want in your army, right? We're just going to continue with that in a minute. But anyway, he says, so don't we want them to be gentle to their own and cruel to their enemies? Because if not, they're not going to wait for others to destroy their own people. They're going to do it. They're going to take over. But he says, but if a man lacks either of these characteristics, either the gentleness that he needs to bring to bear on his own people, or the savagery that he needs to bring to bear on others, if he lacks either one, then he couldn't be a good guardian. But he says, but these conditions resemble impossibilities. And so it follows that a good guardian is impossible. So don't be too quick to run past that point. Because it seems to me he has said something pretty important here. If you think about what it is that you want in the kind of person you're going to try to make a good soldier, a good guardian, it's a real question whether there can be a good guardian. Like, think about the role of, generals in, the American government or the German government or the Canadian government. You think about the way they're portrayed in television programs. That's good enough. In television programs, you always have, the president, it's always the president of the United States, has to make some decision about what to do, and the president has to wisely balance a whole bunch of things, but the generals are always saying, we got to go to war, nuke those guys, let's attack now, while we got the strength, It's possible that individual generals aren't like that, but there's something right about that portrayal of the military. Right? The military, in a way, is defined by the belief that it should, and even the desire that it will, go to war. So, yeah, let's go do that, right? So, there's a real. It seems so. There is a real question: Can people committed to that way of behaving ever truly reflect wise, caring governance? Think about the things you see about the way the police act in the United States. The well-documented, quite inappropriate treatment of black people, right? Is that just a coincidence? Is it just every police officer who, beat up an innocent black person, that just happened to be that police officer was a bad apple? Or does it just happen to be that those police departments have they're bad apple police departments? Or does it just happen to be police in the United States, Or is it something about the nature of police that they like to use their force and on whoever is vulnerable to them? That's kind of the issue that's being raised here. When you set up, the muscle in your society, can you trust it to use that muscle only against the things it should use it against? Should you not be concerned that it's going to use that muscle against things it shouldn't use? And Socrates says, and maybe that has to be the case, right? The idea that these people could bring together the right attitude to their own people, but they could be mean to others, is that maybe that's an impossibility. So I'd like you to think about that. And the idea is, it looks like it might be an impossibility because of the very nature of that thing. So I want you to think about that idea that a good guardian might be a contradiction. So as I said, don't be too quick to run past that point. They're going to go past it. Lots of other things are going to happen, but you need to rest on that point for a while and think about it. But then he says, wait, maybe we have an answer to this. Because, I made this comparison between a puppy and a soldier, right, that they have this nature. Like, maybe we can carry that comparison a bit further, because isn't it the case that, your dog at people it doesn't know, but it'll come and lick your face and be really nice to you. Isn't that true? And that is true. So he says, isn't that what guardians are going to be like? He says, isn't it, this is at 375D, isn't it the case that the disposition of noble dogs is to be as gentle as can be with their families and people they know, and the opposite with those they don't? Yeah, that's right. And so he says, isn't that what we want in a guardian? The answer is yes. And again, I think this description's pretty good here. So he says, goes on and talks about the dog, and he says, so isn't this the case with what the dog does? That if it sees someone it doesn't know, it's angry, although it never had any bad experience with them. But when it sees someone it knows, it greets them warmly, even if it never had a good experience with them. Right? That's exactly what dogs are like. Now, whoa, that's pretty weird. Something that hates things it doesn't know, and something that loves the things it knows, even if they're bad. That sounds pretty awful, but that's how dogs behave, right? Your lovely little 3-year-old daughter is walking down the street, and the dog goes like your daughter's the nicest person on earth and totally innocent, and that dog is, like attacking it like it's the worst enemy ever. Right, so like you've never seen xenophobia, fear of strangers like you've seen it in that dog, and it will, chomp, sure. Right? On the other hand, that dog's owner, slaps it around and so on, and the dog's like, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. Right? That the attitude of the dog is it's hard to imagine something more opposite to a just and fair and accurate appraisal of the people it's involved with. Exactly as Socrates says, it's angry at people it doesn't know just because it doesn't know them, even if it never had a bad experience with them. Right? So a dog will unjustly attack someone who's good just because it doesn't know them. And on the other hand, it greets people warmly whom it knows, even if it's never had a good experience with them. Right? So the dog seems to be the exemplary case of handing out the wrong rewards to people. But that's what dogs are like. And he says, yeah, that's what guardians are like. That's what you want. You want people who are going to defend you and attack the others. But that might not be just. Right? It means you want people who are just going to attack whoever is other to you just because they're other and just because they don't know them. Right? So, in America, you think, oh, there are those Muslims. Oh, we don't know what they are. Let's get them, right? That's xenophobia, right? He's saying, yeah, that's what dogs are like, and that's going to be the character of a guardian. And then he says something that is manifestly ridiculous. He says, doesn't that make the guardian a good philosopher because they are angry at things they don't know and love the things they're familiar with? I mean, what could be more opposite than the ways Socrates has talked about the philosopher? He says, isn't this truly philosophic? And Glaucon ends up agreeing. Whew, that's a shocker. He says, yes, surely, isn't this philosophical? He says, it surely couldn't be anything else. It's hard to imagine someone making a worse mistake in a conversation than the one Glaucon makes there. But yeah, so there we have the love of your own and the hatred of what is alien. And it seems like that's something that gets built in to that notion of the guardian. So why will the guardians defend you and be gentle towards you if they're going to be? Just because they're familiar with you. That's a little bit scary. So this discussion of the guardians, it seems to me, has been a pretty powerful and important description of something, right? Namely, the way that the city nowadays, we haven't seen where the city nowadays comes from. We got the very beginning of an account, but we didn't get the complete account. We didn't see how we got from that so-called city of utmost necessity to the city nowadays. But we do have the city. We know it. We can look around and we can describe it. And he's saying, look, these cities nowadays are built on military. Those are integral to it. And what are those? What's that structure like? And we've seen the real ambivalence of that structure in two ways, right? Even when it's working, it's a pretty ambivalent thing, because it's really just a structure protecting your own, regardless of whether that's just or not, and a xenophobic violence directed outwards, regardless of whether that's just or not. And then on the other hand, what lies behind that is a character to the very reality of the military, that makes it a sort of threat always lying in wait to the very community it's supposed to be guarding. It's a pretty powerful analysis, pretty significant one. But that then also shows why it's going to matter how you deal with that guardian group, that guardian class. And so now we get to the next interruption. So I'm going to tell you that interruption here, and then I think we're going to pause, and I guess I'll come back to that one next time. So now Glaucon's brother interrupts. So then they say, let's educate these men in speech. Let's in argument. Let's give an account of how these guardians are going to need to be educated. And so here he's going to talk with Adeimantus, and they're going to talk about what it would take to educate the guardians that you want. So notice the conversation takes another huge shift here. So we started off with derivation, and then we just dropped that with Glaucon's interruption and went on to description. Now we're dropping that again and going on to something else, which is going to be prescription. They're going to say, how should we educate people to make the kind of guardian that we want? So notice that how this is not just a seamless argument from start to finish where everything works out. It's a series of different things where conversations that would be worthy of being continued are being dropped and new things are being started. So now they're going to say, okay, how should we educate these guardians? I'm going to just do a little bit of a fast forward here so you sort of know what's going to happen, because it matters to how we think about this. So it's this. So far, all that we've called the guardians is soldiers. From the beginning of this conversation with Adeimantus that's going to start here to the end of book 3, they go through this discussion of how we should educate those guardians to produce in them the kind of character that we would want. This prescriptive account rather than descriptive or derivation. And as they go through that study, their sense of what the guardian group needs to be gradually changes and develops, so that by the end of book 3, by the guardians, we no longer just mean the soldiers who are going to fight in those military campaigns. We actually have come to say something else. The guardian class, what we really need to recognize is that the city we're talking about has to have a whole apparatus for sort of protecting itself, both in the sense yes, of course, of having military force to defend against outside invaders, but also in the sense of having a decision-making body that makes good decisions about how to do those sorts of things and so on. So the notion of the guardians that begins when it first comes up, it really just means the military. By the time you've got to the end of book 3, they realize they're talking about what you would normally call the government. And then they say the real guardians are the people who are responsible for running and handling the affairs of the city. And the military that we've been talking about, they're not really the guardians, simply speaking. He calls them the auxiliaries. They're the people, they're a force that the government needs to have at its disposal to carry out various things that it will want. So from this point in book 2 to the end of book 3, we're going to talk about the guardians and their education. But our very sense of what the guardians is gradually evolving over that. So it's important that you recognize that in these pages of book 2, where what is in a city is being described, a word has been used to describe what is in the city, namely the guardians. But what that word contains our understanding of that changes over these two books. So what has not really been presented in book 2 explicitly is the notion of a government. By the end of book 3, you're going to see that's what you do need, a governing body. And that's the word guardians is really going to come to attach to that. So we've identified the role of the guardians when we first said we're going to have people to defend us, right? And that role is gradually going to be shown to need to be the government. And then from the end of book 3 up to the end of book 5, we're not going to read all of that, but in that intervening part, they're gradually going to ask, what do those guardians need to be like? And they're ultimately going to conclude that the people who are going to govern the city need to be wise. And so that he's ultimately going to say, until you have philosophers, or people who are truly wise governing the city, you're not going to have good government. So the sense of who the guardians of the city are shifts in the conversation from the soldiers to the government to the wise. And that's kind of the trajectory of the book from here in book 2 up to book 5. So I want you to know that, so that when you're thinking and talking about the guardians as we study these things, you're already alert to where they're going to go, so that you don't get too misled by things. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there for now. And as with the conversation with Cephalus, I think this conversation with Glaucon that I've talked about is one of the most important parts of the book. So I wanted to go through it in detail. I want you to think about those things in detail. I want you to notice the different kinds of conversation: derivation, description, prescription. I want you to notice the things that populate the city nowadays. I want you to notice the idea that we need guardians, and then the discussion of what kind of character they have, and the introduction of the notion of thumos, or spirit, there. And then I especially want you to notice the issues that are raised there about the problem of the guardians that I've been talking about. And hold on to this idea that the sense of what is contained in that guardian class is going to develop. So let's leave it there for now, and then I'll come back, and I will, next time, I'm going to talk about the latter part of this book 2, where he's talking with Adeimantus, and get that into part of the discussion of book 3 that continues with those same themes.